General Marcus Harlan, a respected war hero, never imagined that the most dangerous battle of his life wouldn't take place on the battlefield, but on a quiet street in his hometown. What began as a routine drive unexpectedly escalated into a tense confrontation with a racist police officer. This story not only exposes the deep-seated injustice, but also serves as a powerful reminder that true courage often lies not in confronting external enemies, but in standing up to right the wrongs within our community. If you find this story meaningful, don't forget to share it and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. General Marcus Harlan, a living symbol of courage and dedication, had spent nearly 3 decades serving in the United States Army, leading hundreds of soldiers through the most dangerous campaigns. Decorated with numerous medals, Marcus wasn't just an exceptional soldier, but also a devoted son and father. It was a peaceful afternoon, with sunlight filtering through the dense canopy along the highway. Marcus, dressed in his impeccable military uniform, drove his sleek black SUV through the small town where he had grown up. The car glided smoothly, its rearview mirror reflecting the sparkle of medals adorning his chest. That day, Marcus had decided to take some rare time off to visit his mother, a woman who had raised him with immense sacrifice and boundless love. His heart was filled with joy as he imagined her warm smile upon seeing her son's surprise visit. But Marcus had no idea that this ordinary trip would soon become one of the greatest challenges of his life. Not on some faraway battlefield, but right here, in the country he had dedicated his life to defending. As the trees lining the road gave way to a wide-open stretch of sky, a sudden flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. A police siren blared, breaking the calm. Marcus glanced in the mirror, his heart skipping a beat. A police car was signaling him to pull over. He frowned, wondering what he might have done wrong. He wasn't speeding, and his vehicle had no apparent issues. Everything seemed to be in order. With the composure and discipline of a soldier, Marcus took a deep breath, steadied himself, and carefully pulled over to the side of the road. Unbeknownst to him, this encounter would change his life forever, raising profound questions about justice, prejudice, and tolerance. General Marcus Harlan's shiny black SUV came to a stop on the shoulder of the road. The piercing wail of the police siren subsided, but the red and blue lights continued to flash, their reflection bouncing off the car windows like an inescapable warning. Marcus exhaled deeply, willing his heartbeat to slow. Though he had faced countless dangers on the battlefield, this tension was entirely different, a silent unease creeping into his every breath. "Stay calm, Marcus," he reminded himself, his hands firmly gripping the steering wheel in plain view. "Cooperate, and everything will be fine." The door of the police cruiser swung open, and a tall man stepped out. Officer Richard Kane, with a rigid demeanor and a piercing, icy gaze, approached Marcus's car. His steps were heavy, each one seeming to weigh down the air around him. Marcus noticed that Kane wasn't holding a notepad or paperwork, items one would expect in a routine stop. Instead, his right hand hovered uncomfortably close to the holster at his hip. "Step out of the car immediately," Kane ordered, his tone commanding and devoid of courtesy. Marcus looked up through the window, maintaining his composure as he responded calmly. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped?" His voice was steady, reflecting the discipline of a seasoned soldier, but instead of answering, Kane repeated himself, this time more sharply. "I said, step out of the car." Marcus immediately sensed something was wrong. A police officer refusing to explain the reason for the stop, skipping procedural checks, and appearing overly tense. None of this felt right. Yet Marcus knew escalating the situation would only make things worse. Is this a misunderstanding? He wondered silently. Slowly, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door. Stepping out, he stood tall in his military uniform, the sunlight glinting off the medals on his chest. Kane's eyes flicked over the uniform briefly, but instead of showing respect, his expression grew colder and more suspicious. "What are you doing here?" Kane asked, his voice laden with hostility. "People like you don't usually drive through this area." Marcus remained calm, though he felt his blood simmering beneath the surface. "I'm just on my way to visit my mother," he replied, keeping his tone measured. Kane stepped closer, his gaze attempting to pierce through Marcus. The phrase, "people like you," echoed in Marcus's mind, the words dripping with prejudice and revealing the officer's deep-seated bias. A small crowd began to gather along the roadside, bystanders who had stopped to watch the unfolding scene. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others whispered to one another. The atmosphere grew tense, the weight of every second pressing down on Marcus. He knew that each of his actions would be scrutinized and might determine his safety. "Don't do anything to provoke him," Marcus reminded himself, even as his thoughts swirled with frustration. "Why do I have to deal with this, here in the country I've spent my life defending?" Marcus stood still, his calm exterior masking the growing unease within him. He was no stranger to tense situations, but this tension was unlike anything he'd faced on the battlefield. It stemmed not from a hostile enemy, but from the man standing before him, a man sworn to uphold justice. Kane's eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, pausing briefly on the gleaming medals on his chest. Instead of respect, Kane's expression turned to derision, his lips curling into a sneer. "What's with the uniform?" Kane scoffed. "You think wearing that makes me believe you?" Marcus took a deep breath to steady himself. "Officer, I'm General Marcus Harlan, United States Army. If you need to verify my identity, I'd be happy to provide my documentation." But Kane ignored his explanation. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze sharp and accusing. "I don't care who you are. What I want to know is what's in the car. Drugs? Weapons?" Kane's tone was laced with unfounded suspicion. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The injustice in Kane's words and demeanor was palpable. "Officer, I assure you, I'm not carrying anything illegal," Marcus replied, his tone still patient. "If you'd like, I'm willing to allow a search of the vehicle." Kane's hostility only grew. "I've seen plenty of guys like you," he growled, his right hand grazing the holster at his hip. "You think you can drive a car like this and not make me suspicious?" The crowd along the roadside began to grow, their curious eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. A few people took out their phones, recording the interaction, while others murmured among themselves. The tension in the air was thick, amplifying the pressure on Marcus. Despite the insults, Marcus maintained his composure. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job. If you allow me to present my paperwork, we can resolve this matter quickly." Kane sneered. "You think you're clever, huh? Don't try to act smart with me. I've seen people like you line my entire career." Marcus's mind raced. He had faced enemies in combat and saved comrades in dire situations, but now he found himself enduring humiliation on the very soil he had dedicated his life to protecting, all because of the color of his skin. This has gone too far. Marcus thought. But he knew any misstep or misplaced word could escalate the situation further. So he stayed silent, standing tall and letting Kane proceed with his actions. Suddenly, Kane lowered his voice, though his eyes remained locked on Marcus. "Now, I want you to get back in the car, open the door, and let me inspect the interior. Don't touch anything," Kane ordered. Marcus met Kane's gaze with calm defiance. "I will comply with your request, but I must reiterate that I have nothing illegal in the vehicle." Kane offered no response. Instead, he took a step back, his hand hovering near his firearm, his eyes tracking Marcus's every move as if he were a genuine threat. Marcus turned back toward his SUV and slowly opened the door, his movements deliberate to avoid further agitating Kane. He didn't know what would happen next, but a deep sense of unease gnawed at him. The question echoed in his mind. Why do I have to prove myself like this? Simply because of the color of my skin. Standing tall after opening the car door, Marcus kept his eyes fixed on Kane with an air of calm resolve. Yet he was acutely aware that the situation was deteriorating. Kane had not asked for his license or vehicle registration, standard protocol in any traffic stop. Instead, his icy stare remained locked on Marcus, as though he were a criminal. "Who do you think you are, driving a car like this through my jurisdiction?" Kane's voice was sharp with accusation. Marcus maintained his measured tone. "Officer, as I've said, I'm on my way to visit my mother. I don't understand why I'm under suspicion, but I'm here to cooperate and clear up any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Kane sneered, stepping closer, his eyes practically burning with hostility. "You think I'll fall for that? I've seen plenty like you, always have a nice little story to tell, but I know you're hiding something." A wave of anger surged through Marcus. The words, "people like you," were unmistakable. Kane's suspicion wasn't based on Marcus's actions but on the color of his skin. For a fleeting moment, Marcus wanted to speak out, to defend his dignity. But years of military training reminded him, sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one before you, but the one within, your reaction. Marcus inhaled deeply, clenching his hands to keep them from trembling with anger. He understood that any sudden movement or ill-timed words could turn this volatile situation into a disaster. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice steady yet firm, "I understand you're doing your job, but may I ask why I was stopped? I have nothing illegal, and I can provide all necessary documents if you'd like to check." Kane ignored him. Instead, he circled the SUV, scrutinizing every detail as though searching for evidence of wrongdoing. "This car," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "It doesn't suit someone like you." Marcus felt the weight of the insult, but swallowed his frustration. He knew arguing would only make matters worse. He bit down on his anger, standing motionless as Kane continued his so-called inspection. Memories from the battlefield flooded Marcus's mind. He recalled moments where composure had meant the difference between life and death. But this time, the bitter truth struck harder. This wasn't a foreign enemy. This was his own country, a nation he had fought to defend. And yet, here he was, targeted not for what he had done, but for who he was. Kane returned to face Marcus, his expression still seething with suspicion. "What's in the car?" Kane demanded. "Weapons? Drugs?" Marcus exhaled deeply, his voice calm but resolute. "There's nothing of the sort, officer. You're welcome to search the car. I won't resist." Kane didn't reply. His hand moved closer to his holster, his eyes unblinking, as though preparing for the worst. The air grew heavier, thick with unspoken tension. The onlookers had now stopped moving entirely, their cameras focused on the unfolding scene. But no one dared step forward. Marcus felt the seconds into an eternity. Standing upright and unwavering, he braced himself for whatever might come. Inside, the same question echoed endlessly. Why must I endure this, in the land I've sacrificed everything to protect? No answer came, and the standoff dragged on, each moment heavier than the last. Marcus kept his gaze fixed forward, his hands raised high, suppressing the fury and helplessness boiling within him. He had faced situations far more perilous on the battlefield, yet this was the first time he felt utterly powerless over his fate. Kane's gaze, the gun in his hand, and his authoritative tone turned Marcus's every move into a potential threat. "Get on the ground, now!" Kane shouted again, his voice louder and more commanding, as if sheer volume could subdue Marcus. Slowly, Marcus bent down, careful not to move too quickly and risk escalating Kane's agitation. He glanced briefly at the growing crowd, worried faces, smartphones recording every second, and eyes filled with a mix of fear and outrage. A woman covered her mouth as if stifling a scream, while others stood frozen, perhaps feeling as powerless as Marcus himself. "I'm complying," Marcus said, his voice steady but heavy. "I am unarmed and not resisting." He lowered himself to his knees, feeling the heat of the pavement seep through his uniform, the jagged pebbles pressed against his knees, a sharp reminder of his current humiliation. The hands that once held weapons to defend his nation now bore his weight against the harsh ground. Lying face down, his cheek nearly pressed to the dirt, he squinted against the glaring sunlight reflecting off the dusty pavement. Kane approached and dropped his knee onto Marcus's back with force. The weight pressed sharply against Marcus's ribs, sending a jolt of pain through his chest. He inhaled deeply, attempting to regulate his breathing, though each breath felt constricted under the crushing force. "Don't move," Kane barked, his voice cutting through the tense air like a whip. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, willing himself to remain calm. "I've endured worse," he reminded himself. But the truth was, this wasn't just physical pain. This was degradation, a violation of everything he had stood for and sacrificed. He wasn't. Being treated as a suspect, but as someone unworthy of respect, someone dehumanized. The crowd around them continued to grow, their murmurs swelling into a low roar. An elderly man shouted, "He's done nothing wrong. Let him go." A young woman clasped her hands tightly, her voice trembling. "He's in uniform. He's a general." But Kane seemed deaf to their pleas, his knee firmly planted on Marcus's back, his gaze scanning the crowd warily as if expecting them to turn hostile. Marcus could feel the weight of every gaze on him. He was no longer the imposing general in a gleaming uniform, but just a black man, pinned under the knee of authority. A wave of shame surged through him as he thought of his mother, waiting for him at home. She had always been proud of him, of what he had achieved. But now, if she saw this, what would she think? Kane leaned closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you're special? Don't expect any favors here. I know your type." The words cut through Marcus like a blade. "Your type," he repeated silently, the phrase tightening like a vice around his chest. He had spent a lifetime proving his worth, not with words but with actions, with sacrifice. Yet here, to Kane, All that mattered was the color of his skin. The crowd began to stir more fervently. A tall man stepped forward, shouting, "Enough! He hasn't done anything. Let him go." Kane didn't move, his hand still near his gun, as though the smallest gesture might spark chaos. Marcus felt the weight pressing harder on his back, but he refused to retaliate. If I react, I'll become exactly what he already assumes I am, he reminded himself. His pride was wounded, but he knew this wasn't about preserving ego, it was about staying alive. The sound of cameras and video recordings filled the air. Marcus realized that this incident wouldn't end here. It would be seen, shared, and talked about. It would become another story of injustice in a country he had given everything to protect. How much longer do I have to endure this? Marcus wondered. But, like every battle he had fought, he understood that the most important thing wasn't the pain. It was how he would rise above it. The noise on the street grew louder as more people gathered, their eyes fixed on the shocking scene unfolding before them. General Marcus Harlan, clad in his dignified military uniform, lay face down on the asphalt, Kane's knee digging into his back. The medals on Marcus's chest, now dulled by dirt, still caught the light, drawing the attention of several in the crowd. "This is unbelievable. He's in uniform," a woman exclaimed from the back, her voice shaking. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filled with equal parts outrage and fear. "He's a soldier. Why are they doing this to him?" The murmurs spread like wildfire, growing louder as more people began to realize the gravity of the situation. Phones were held aloft, cameras capturing every second. The whispers turned into audible protests as the crowd's understanding deepened. "Let him go. He's done nothing wrong," a voice bellowed from the crowd, igniting a spark of indignation. The chant, "Let him go," began to ripple through the bystanders, gaining strength with each repetition. Kane remained steadfast, his knee pressed into Marcus's back, his cold gaze darting across the crowd. His grip on his firearm tightened, though the confidence in his demeanor started to waver. His once defiant expression now carried a hint of unease. From within the crowd, a young man stepped forward. Dressed in a plain t-shirt and jeans, his eyes burned with determination. Adam, a local college student, had stumbled upon the scene and couldn't remain silent in the face of such blatant injustice. "Stop this!" Adam shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Holding his phone firmly in his hand, he stared directly at Kane. "What are you doing? He's a general. Can't you see that?" Kane turned to Adam, his face clouded with suspicion. "Step back," he barked, his voice harsher than before, as if to mask his growing uncertainty. "This is none of your business." "None of my business?" Adam stepped closer, his anger palpable. "This is everyone's business. He hasn't done anything wrong, and you're abusing your authority. Aren't you ashamed?" Adam's words resonated with the crowd. More voices joined in, shouting, "Let him go! Let him go!" A middle-aged man in a suit pointed at Kane, his voice rising above the din. "We all see he's not resisting. Why are you treating him this way?" Kane's composure began to crack. The once unyielding officer now seemed increasingly aware of the mounting pressure from the crowd. He glanced around, nervously aware that dozens of eyes and cameras were focused on him, recording his every move. Adam, undeterred, took another step forward, now just a few feet away from Kane. "I'm recording this, and I'll make sure it's seen everywhere," Adam declared, his voice unwavering. "You can't cover this up. You can't abuse your power and expect no consequences." Kane squinted at Adam, his voice faltering. "Back off, if you don't want to be arrested for interfering with an officer." "Arrest me if you want," Adam shot back, his voice unflinching. "But know this, you won't silence the truth. Everyone here is watching." The crowd erupted again. A woman shouted, "We won't stay quiet. This is wrong." A young man next to Adam added, "He fought to protect this country, and you're treating him like this? Shame on you." Kane's grip on his gun tightened, but his resolve visibly wavered. The weight of the crowd's outrage, their cameras capturing every second, began to erode his confidence. His knee, once firmly pressing on Marcus's back, seemed to loosen slightly. Marcus, still pinned to the ground, felt the shift in the air. Though he couldn't see the crowd, he heard Adam's unwavering voice and the swelling protests around him. A flicker of hope ignited within him amidst the humiliation and pain. Proof that there were still people willing to stand up for justice. The crowd was no longer a group of passive spectators. They had become a collective force, a wall of resistance pressing against Kane's authority. And yet, Kane clung stubbornly to his position, as if refusing to acknowledge his diminishing power. "You can't keep him there forever," Adam shouted, his voice steady and commanding. "If you don't release him, we won't leave. Do you want the world to see this?" Kane remained silent, his jaw clenched tight. The crowd held its breath, ready to erupt at the slightest provocation. Marcus, despite the weight pressing on him, knew that this battle wasn't just his own. It was a fight for justice, for truth, and for everyone who dared to challenge injustice. The piercing sound of a police siren broke the mounting tension at the scene. A second patrol car sped onto the street, its red and blue lights casting vivid reflections on the gathered crowd. The chaos momentarily paused as all eyes turned toward the new arrival. The car door swung open, and out stepped Lieutenant Emily Carter, tall, composed, and radiating an aura of authority. Her sharp features and piercing gaze commanded immediate silence as she strode purposefully toward the commotion. Emily stopped briefly to survey the scene. The sight before her sparked an uncontainable surge of anger. A man in a pristine military uniform, adorned with medals, pressed face down onto the pavement under the weight of Officer Kane's knee. But it wasn't just the uniform, it was the man himself, General Marcus Harlan, her former comrade in arms during countless perilous campaigns. Her fury boiled over. With each step toward the scene, her voice thundered, cutting through the still-charged atmosphere. "What in the world is going on here?" Kane flinched at the sharpness of her tone, his head snapping up to meet her gaze. Recognition and unease flickered across his face as he realized the figure approaching was his superior, Lieutenant Emily Carter. Scrambling to recover, he stood up abruptly, his knee finally lifting off Marcus's back, and attempted to regain his composure. "Lieutenant," he stammered, "I was handling a suspicious individual. I suspected he might be carrying something illegal." Emily stopped a few feet from him, her eyes narrowing as she bore down on him. "A suspicious individual?" she repeated, her voice dripping with cold, deliberate emphasis. "Your suspicious individual happens to be General Marcus Harlan, a man who has spent his life serving this country. Tell me, Kane, what exactly are you accusing him of?" Kane faltered, his gaze darting to avoid her penetrating stare. "Lieutenant, I didn't know who he was. He was acting suspiciously, and I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Emily's voice sliced through the air like a blade. She took another step closer, her tone as sharp as her gaze. "Your protocol involves drawing your weapon and pinning a decorated general to the ground without checking his identification or allowing him to explain himself? Is this your idea of law enforcement?" The crowd, now significantly larger, fell into a heavy silence, intently observing the exchange. A murmur rippled through the gathering as people began to process the weight of what they were witnessing. A man muttered, "He's a general?" An elderly woman holding her child's hand whispered, "I can't believe this. They've done this to a hero." Emily turned her attention to Marcus, who was still on the ground. Her voice softened, though it retained its clarity. "General Harlan," she said, "are you all right?" Marcus lifted his head slowly, his eyes weary but unyielding. The familiar voice brought him a fleeting sense of relief. "Carter," he rasped, his tone tinged with irony. "I'm fine. Just surprised by the warm welcome on the soil I defended." Emily bent down, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. She then turned back to Kane, her voice hardening once more. "Release him immediately." Kane hesitated, his eyes darting to the crowd, which was now brimming with expectant silence and phones raised high, recording every second. Reluctantly, he stepped back, removing his knee from Marcus's back. Marcus sat up slowly, bracing himself on one arm and brushing the dirt from his uniform with the other. The medals on his chest, though smudged with dust, still glimmered faintly in the sunlight. Emily addressed the crowd with a firm, resonant voice. "Listen to me. The man you see before you is General Marcus Harlan. He's not just a soldier, he is a hero. He has led hundreds of soldiers into battle and dedicated his life to serving this country. The way he has been treated today is unacceptable." Murmurs of awe and outrage spread through the crowd like wildfire. A young man shouted, "How could they treat a general like this? It's a disgrace." Kane stood frozen, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. His gaze dropped to the ground, unable to meet Emily's or Marcus's eyes. The mounting pressure from Emily and the crowd's collective indignation had completely eroded his authority. Emily turned back to Kane, her tone colder than ever. "You've made a grave mistake, Kane," she declared. "I will personally report your actions to your superiors, and I guarantee this will not be overlooked." Kane swallowed hard, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. He stepped back further, as though trying to escape the heat of her gaze. Emily returned her attention to Marcus, helping him to his feet. She placed a steadying hand on his arm, her eyes filled with empathy. "You shouldn't have had to endure this, General," she said quietly. "I'm deeply sorry for what's happened." Marcus stood upright, his gaze steady and composed, though his eyes reflected a profound sadness. He looked at Emily, his voice low but resolute. "Carter, this isn't just about me. It's about something far bigger. If this can happen to me, how many others are treated this way without anyone standing up for them?" Emily nodded, her expression resolute. "You're right, sir," she replied. "This is something we need to change." Their words hung heavily in the air, a clarion call to justice. The crowd, once passive spectators, now understood the gravity of what they had witnessed. A story not just of confrontation, but of courage, injustice, and the unyielding pursuit of change. Kane stood frozen in place, his trembling hands at his sides and beads of sweat trickling down his forehead. The authority he had clung to so desperately now seemed like a flimsy facade. Lieutenant Emily Carter's sharp words, combined with the crowd's angry stares, pressed down on him like an unbearable weight. "Lieutenant," Kane stammered, his voice shaky. I didn't know. I just thought he was acting suspicious." Emily took another step closer, her piercing gaze cutting through him like a blade. "Suspicious?" she repeated, her voice dripping with derision. "And how exactly do you define suspicious? A man in a military uniform, covered in medals, cooperating with you from the very start? Or is it simply because his skin color doesn't match yours?" Kane inhaled sharply, attempting to defend himself. "No, Lieutenant, that's not what I meant. I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Emily interrupted, her words like an arrow striking his pride. "What protocol justifies drawing your weapon and pinning a U.S. Army general to the ground without checking his ID or hearing him out? Tell me, Kane, what protocol is that?" Emily's words shredded the last remnants of Kane's confidence. He dropped his gaze to the ground, avoiding her piercing stare. Meanwhile, the crowd around them, already seething with anger, erupted. "Let him go. He's done nothing wrong. This is blatant racism. Fire him." A middle-aged man pointed a finger directly at Kane, his voice boiling with fury. "What gives you the right? That's a hero. You've humiliated not only him, but also everything this country stands for." The crowd's condemnation rained down on Kane like hammer blows. He could feel the disgust in every word, every glance. But what scared him most were the raised phones, recording everything. He knew his actions would spread like wildfire, leaving no corner for him to hide. Kane glanced at Marcus, who now stood upright with Emily's support. The general's calm, steady gaze bore into him, carrying a weight that no amount of shouting could match. It was a look that pierced straight through Kane's defenses, exposing his inadequacies. Kane stammered, I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean to." Emily turned her sharp eyes back to Kane, cutting off his feeble explanation. "Didn't know?" she repeated with disdain. "So, if he weren't a general, are you saying your actions would be justified? Do you think you have the right to treat anyone like this, regardless of who they are?" The crowd roared in agreement. Cries of, "That's right," and "No one deserves to be treated this way," echoed through the street. An elderly woman shook her head, her voice trembling with emotion. "If he weren't wearing that uniform, would we ever know who he is? How many others have suffered like this with no one to defend them?" Marcus, now fully upright, maintained his gaze on Kane. Though his body still ached and his dignity had been deeply wounded, he chose to remain silent. There was nothing more he needed to say. Kane's actions, Emily's words, and the crowd's outrage spoke volumes. Emily turned to Marcus, her expression softening with deep respect. "General Harlan," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Is there anything you'd like to say? Any request you have for Officer Kane?" Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes reflecting weariness yet steadfast determination. He shook his head gently and spoke in a low, clear voice. "No, Carter. I don't need to say anything. I think the people here have spoken for me." His words brought a hush over the crowd. They realized his silence was not a weakness. It was a powerful statement. It was the silence of someone who knew his worth and had no need to defend it. The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering, "You're amazing, General," and "We stand with you." Kane stood motionless, feeling as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse as he muttered, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I made a mistake." Emily, however, was unrelenting. "Yes, you made a mistake," she said, her tone cold and firm, "and that mistake will not be ignored. I will ensure that your actions are thoroughly reviewed and you will be held accountable." Kane bowed his head further, unable to respond. His shoulders sagged, and his remaining strength seemed to drain away. He knew there was no way out. His mistake had been laid bare before the entire world, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Marcus closed his eyes briefly as if trying to steady himself. Inside, a storm of emotions raged: pain, anger, and deep disappointment in the country he had devoted his life to defending. Yet amidst the turmoil, he felt a glimmer of hope. People like Emily, Adam, and the crowd that had rallied to his side were proof that goodness and the fight for justice still thrived. Finally, Marcus opened his eyes and looked directly at Kane. He said nothing, but his gaze conveyed a profound message. Learn from this mistake if you truly wish to change. At that moment, everyone present understood that Marcus Harlan was not just a hero on the battlefield. He was a symbol of resilience, dignity, and hope for a fairer, more just society. Kane stood with his head bowed, as though the weight of every gaze bore down on him, piercing his fractured pride. The silence of General Marcus Harlan, the commanding words of Lieutenant Emily Carter, and the crowd's fiery anger pressed against him like a vice, leaving him breathless. The air around him seemed thick and suffocating. Emily's unwavering stare pinned him in place, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What are you waiting for, Kane? You owe General Harlan an apology, not just for the insult you've dealt him, but for disgracing yourself and the uniform you wear." Kane lifted his head slightly, his lips trembling. He faltered, his voice cracking under the pressure. I'm sorry." Emily crossed her arms, her gaze unrelenting. "Not enough. A hollow apology won't suffice. What are you apologizing for, Kane? Be specific, so everyone here knows that you understand where you went wrong." Kane took a deep, shaky breath, sweat dripping down his temples. His eyes flicked to the crowd gathered on the sidewalk, their phones still raised, recording his every word, his every move. He realized there was no escape. "I was wrong," Kane began, his voice steadier this time. "I shouldn't have acted the way I did. I shouldn't have drawn my gun or forced him to the ground without listening or checking his identification. I misjudged him. No, I misjudged the man he is, because of my own bias. General Harlan, I'm deeply sorry." Kane paused, but no one in the crowd spoke. The atmosphere was heavy with silence, waiting for more. Emily remained still, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Continue," she said curtly. Kane glanced at Marcus, his face filled with shame. "General Harlan," he said, lowering his voice, "I not only disrespected you but also hurt your honor and dignity. I have no excuse for my actions. All I can say is that I will take responsibility, and I hope you can accept my apology." The crowd began to murmur. A few people shook their heads, others exchanged incredulous looks. An older man in the crowd spoke up, his voice firm. "An apology is one thing, but he needs to be held accountable. He can't just say a few words and walk away from this." Emily nodded slightly as if agreeing with the sentiment. She turned to Kane, her voice sharp. "An apology is a first step, Kane. But do you understand that your words mean nothing without actions? You'll need to prove that you truly understand where you went wrong." Kane lowered his head. "I understand," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll make amends. I don't expect forgiveness right now, but I'll do everything I can to make things right." At this moment, Marcus, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was deep and calm, yet it carried a weight that made everyone listen. "I accept your apology, Kane," he said, "but you need to understand that this isn't just about you. This isn't merely the mistake of an individual. This is a problem rooted in an entire system. You are a product of that system, and it is the biases it nurtures that led to your actions." Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the crowd as if delivering his message to everyone present. "If this can happen to me, a man in uniform with medals on my chest, what happens to those without a voice? To those who have no one to protect them? How many people have been treated unfairly, with no one to stand up for them? This is what we need to change, not just for me, but for everyone." A heavy silence settled over the scene. Marcus's words echoed like a tolling bell, forcing everyone to reflect. A young woman in the crowd wiped away tears and said softly, "He's right. This isn't just about today. This is about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly and had no one to speak up for them." Kane looked at Marcus, fully absorbing the disappointment and pain in his eyes. I will change," Kane said, his voice choked with emotion. "I can't undo what happened, but I promise I'll do better. I won't let this happen to anyone else." Marcus gave a small nod, his eyes resolute. "I hope you're serious about your promise," he said, "because if you're not, all these words will mean nothing." Lieutenant Carter stepped closer to Marcus, her tone formal but filled with compassion. "General Harlan," she said, "you have every right to press charges against Kane. If you choose to do so, I'll personally ensure that the proper procedures are followed without delay." Marcus remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on Kane, who now looked like a man completely undone. Kane knew he had made a grave mistake, but he seemed lost, unsure of how to right his wrongs. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the crowd's condemnation and the enormity of his error. After a long pause, Marcus took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady and resolute. "No." The single word cut through the tense air, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few voices rose in surprise. "No?" a man near the front exclaimed. "He's going to let him go?" Emily looked at Marcus with surprise but refrained from interrupting. She trusted that Marcus had his reasons and waited to hear what he would say. Marcus turned back to Kane, his gaze stern yet devoid of malice. "Kane," he began, his tone calm but weighty, "I could press charges. I have every right to do so, and you know that you deserve to face the consequences of your actions. But I won't." Kane's head shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief and shame. He opened his mouth as though to respond, but couldn't find the words. Marcus continued, his voice measured and deliberate. "I'm not letting you off because you're innocent, but because I believe people can change. Your mistake today is a reminder, not just for you, but for all of us, that prejudice and injustice still thrive in a system that's supposed to protect us." Turning to the crowd, Marcus addressed them directly, his voice gaining strength. "This isn't just about me," he declared. "I was fortunate today. I had a voice. I had people stand up for me. But how many others don't get that chance? How many are mistreated without anyone ever knowing? We must change this, not for me, but for everyone." The crowd fell silent, moved by the weight of his words. A few wiped away tears, others nodded in solemn agreement. "He's right," an older woman called out. "We can't let this kind of thing keep happening." Marcus faced Kane once more, his eyes softer but still firm. "Kane," he said, I hope you don't waste this opportunity. I hope you take today's lesson and use it to become a better person and a better officer. If you truly want to make amends, start today, not with words but with actions." Kane nodded vigorously, his voice trembling but sincere. "Yes, sir, I understand. I'll do everything I can to make this right. I promise." The crowd's anger began to shift, replaced by admiration and respect for Marcus. A young man started clapping, and soon the entire crowd joined in, their applause echoing down the street. Cries of, "You're incredible, General Harlan," and "A true hero," rang out. Emily stepped beside Marcus, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her gaze was filled with admiration. "You've done something remarkable today, sir," she said. "You've shown that leadership isn't just about commanding on the battlefield. It's about being a symbol of justice and compassion." Marcus offered a faint smile, though his eyes still carried a deep sadness. "Carter," he said slowly, "if we don't believe in people's capacity for change, then everything we fight for becomes meaningless. I won't let that happen." Kane stepped back, bowing his head deeply in gratitude. He knew his promises couldn't end here. He would have to live by the lesson Marcus had imparted, not just for Marcus's sake, but for the good of the system and the society he served. But before leaving, Marcus glanced at the crowd. He felt an unresolved weight lingering within him, and the eyes of the crowd watched him expectantly, as if hoping for something greater. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over each face, elderly individuals, young women, children clutching their mothers' hands. Each person wore a different expression: frustration, admiration, hope. At that moment, Marcus realized that his responsibility extended beyond addressing Kane or safeguarding his dignity. He needed to deliver a broader, more powerful message, one that would resonate with everyone present. "What happened today," Marcus began, his voice deep and commanding like a declaration, "is not just an incident. It is a reflection of a larger problem we can no longer ignore." The crowd fell completely silent. His words cut through the air, reverberating in each listener's heart. "I, General Marcus Harlan, have stood on battlefields, facing the most dangerous enemies to protect this nation. But today, I faced something far more heartbreaking, an injustice within my homeland." Marcus paused for a moment, his eyes heavy as they rested on Kane, who stood with his head bowed, shoulders weighed down by guilt. "Kane's mistake today," Marcus continued, "is not just the mistake of one man. It is the result of a system we have allowed to fester for too long, a system that fosters prejudice, discrimination, and injustice. And this doesn't just affect me, it affects all of us." A young woman in the crowd exclaimed, "He's right. We need to change this." Others nodded, their faces lighting up with agreement. Marcus turned back to the crowd, his expression firm. "Today, I was fortunate to have a voice, to have people stand up for me. But what about those who don't have that chance? How many have been forced to endure in silence because no one stood by their side? How many have been victimized by prejudice simply because they didn't fit the mold society expects?" A profound silence enveloped the gathering, but Marcus knew his words were reaching deep into each heart. He took another breath and continued. "Change cannot come from one person or one day. It requires all of us, every person standing here, every small action, every strong voice. Don't let today be just another forgotten event. Let it be the beginning of something greater." The crowd began to murmur, and then a few people clapped. The applause grew louder, and soon The entire crowd joined in a thunderous ovation. An older man shouted, "We won't forget your words. Justice must prevail." Emily stepped forward to stand beside Marcus. She stood tall, her voice resolute as she addressed him. "General Harlan," she said, turning to him, "you've spoken truths that all of us, especially those in law enforcement, need to hear. As an officer, I pledge that Kane's actions will not go unanswered. I will personally ensure he is investigated thoroughly and transparently." Nearby, Kane lowered his head even further, as though Emily's words were a sentence he could not escape. Emily continued, this time addressing the crowd. "However," she said, her voice growing stronger, "this is not just about one individual. I will work with my colleagues to push for changes in law enforcement, starting with rooting out prejudice and ensuring that everyone is treated fairly. This is my promise to you, General Harlan, and to all of you here." The crowd erupted into applause, with some shouting, "This is what we need." An elderly woman told the person beside her, "Finally, someone is standing up for justice." Marcus gave Emily a slight nod, his eyes reflecting gratitude. "Thank you, Carter," he said. "You're not just a police officer, but a true leader. I hope your commitment inspires others within this system." Emily bowed her head in acknowledgement, though her gaze held firm determination. "I won't let this promise become meaningless, sir," she replied. Marcus turned back to the crowd one last time. "Thank you, all of you," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the space. "Not for me, but for standing up for what is right. I leave today with the belief that we can bring about change. But that change cannot come from me alone. It must come from all of us." Thunderous applause followed his words, accompanied by cries of "Justice" and "Thank you, General Harlan." A young man raised his fist and shouted, "You're not just a soldier, you're a symbol of hope." As Marcus got into his car, he felt a strange silence enveloping the scene. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was heavy with emotion, as if everyone was processing what had just transpired. He started the engine, his gaze unintentionally catching the rearview mirror, where he saw Kane still standing, his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the ground as if trying to avoid reality. Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. He turned off the engine, sighed, and opened the door to step out again. The crowd had not dispersed. When they saw Marcus return, they immediately quieted, their eyes following him intently. No one knew what he was about to do, but they understood that anything he said now would carry tremendous weight. Marcus walked slowly toward Kane. The man remained motionless, as if frozen, and when he realized Marcus was approaching, his body tensed, full of anxiety and fear. Standing in front of Kane, Marcus remained silent for a few seconds. He looked directly at him, his expression both stern and unreadable. Kane lifted his head slightly, but quickly lowered it again, as though unable to face the man he had wronged and humiliated. The crowd was utterly silent, waiting for something to happen. "Do you know why I chose not to press charges against you?" Marcus asked, his voice calm yet imbued with undeniable authority. Kane stammered, unable to form a coherent response. Marcus didn't wait for an answer and continued. "It's not because I want to forgive you immediately," he said, his gaze firm. "It's not because I want to overlook what you've done. I chose not to press charges because I believe change can only begin when we're allowed to change. And today, I'm giving you that opportunity." Kane lifted his head, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Sir, "I'm truly sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I have no excuse for my actions, but I won't let you down. I promise." Marcus gave a faint smile, a fleeting expression that carried no relief. "Don't make promises to me, Kane," he said. "Make them to yourself, to the people you'll encounter in the future. I don't need to hear your apology. I need to see your actions. Don't waste this chance." Kane bowed his head, this time out of respect rather than shame. He said nothing more, but a flicker of determination appeared in his eyes. Whether it was genuine resolve or a fleeting reaction, Marcus couldn't be sure, and perhaps neither could Kane. Marcus turned back toward the crowd, now hanging on to his every word and gesture. He took a deep breath, letting his gaze travel over each face. Some still looked angry with Kane, while others had begun discussing what might happen next. But all awaited something from Marcus, a final word to close this emotionally charged chapter. "I hope today is not just a lesson for Kane," Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying with strength and conviction. "I hope it's a lesson for all of us, a lesson that change cannot come from hatred or punishment. It can only come from understanding and responsibility, not just to correct mistakes, but to build a better society." His words brought the crowd to complete silence. Some nodded in agreement, their eyes reflecting newfound understanding. An elderly woman murmured, "He's right. We need to look at ourselves to change, not just point fingers at others." Marcus walked back to his car, his steps slow but deliberate. Before getting in, he paused and glanced once more at Kane. "Kane," he said, his voice deep but resonant, "I place my trust in you today. Don't make me regret it." Kane lifted his head, his eyes filled with emotion. "I won't, sir. I promise." Marcus sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Outside, the golden hues of sunset painted the sky, but within him, a storm of indescribable emotions churned. He couldn't help but recall Kane's conflicted eyes, filled with regret, pride, and a faint glimmer of hope. The car rolled slowly through the peaceful streets, but behind Marcus, the story had taken root in the hearts of the crowd. Quiet conversations began to ripple through the air, not loud, but deeply meaningful. A middle-aged woman turned to her friend and said, "He's different, not because of his strength or authority, but because he dared to do what we only dare to think about." Her companion nodded, her gaze distant. "You're right. Sometimes courage isn't about confrontation. It's about teaching others how to face themselves." Behind him, Kane still stood in place, his legs seemingly unable to move, his eyes fixed on Marcus's car as it disappeared. The events of the afternoon replayed vividly in his mind, every word, every action of Marcus striking deeply within, leaving him unable to shake the weight of his guilt. Kane had never imagined that a moment so small could shift his perspective so profoundly. But here, in the aftermath, one truth stood clear. He had been wrong, and for the first time in his life, he wanted to make things right. An older man approached Kane, his eyes thoughtful but firm. "You know," the man said, his voice gravelly, "Marcus didn't do this to be a hero. He did it to remind us that no one is perfect, but we all have the chance to be better versions of ourselves." Kane turned to look at the man, silent, but his gaze had changed. Gone was the defiance, replaced by acceptance and resolve. The crowd began to disperse, but the story of the day lingered, taking root in each witness's heart. From the children standing on the sidewalk to the elderly leaning on canes, watching with pensive eyes. In small corners of the neighborhood, conversations about Marcus began to sprout. A group of young people discussed the event animatedly, one of them saying, "If we want change, maybe it's time to stop blaming circumstances and start with ourselves." Meanwhile, in his car, Marcus remained silent. He didn't need accolades, nor did he seek recognition for leaving with a heavy heart. Marcus understood that the real battle wasn't in the words or the stares of the crowd, but in the quiet, gradual, yet profound transformations within each individual. It was something he had always believed. True change starts from within. Kane eventually left the scene, walking silently through familiar streets that now seemed different. Each step felt like a reminder. He had to change. He recalled Marcus's gaze, not one of judgment, but of quiet hope, as if saying, "You can do better." Back home, Kane sat in an old chair in his dimly lit living room. The light cast a somber glow on his pensive face. He began writing a letter, not to Marcus, but to himself. The words in the letter were promises, commitments not to let the day's events fade into mere memory. "I will do better," Kane wrote, his hand trembling, "not just for myself, but for those who believe I can change." As for Marcus, when he returned to his modest home, he paused on the porch, gazing up at the darkening sky. Within him, a small flicker of hope arose. Marcus didn't know if Kane or anyone in the crowd would truly change, but he knew one thing. He had planted a seed, and that seed, if nurtured by determination, could grow into a mighty tree. In the days that followed, the story of Marcus and Kane became the main topic in the neighborhood. No one spoke loudly about it, but small actions began to surface. An older man took the time to listen to a street child's story instead of chasing him away. A young woman stood up for her friend in the face of injustice. And Kane. He started visiting the library daily, reading books, jotting down notes, preparing for a journey to rebuild himself. Marcus didn't need to know about these things. He understood that great changes don't require the witness of the one who sows the seed. What mattered was that they happened. Kane, the people in the crowd, and the small neighborhood, all were changing, little by little, because of a moment Marcus had created. In the end, the story didn't stop there. It spread far and wide, not just as a lesson in redemption, but as a reminder that change is never too late. All it takes is one person daring to begin and another willing to listen. The journey of Ethan Carter at the Blue Ridge Police Department proved one undeniable truth. Change, no matter how difficult, is possible if we have enough persistence and determination. From a department riddled with a toxic culture, he has now built a team that is fair, dedicated, and trustworthy. What did you think of this story? If you were in Marcus's position, how would you have handled the situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer James Thompson walked down the gray corridor of Central County Jail's B block. It was another ordinary Tuesday evening in March, or so he thought. The sound of his polished black boots echoed against the concrete floor, mixing with the usual background noise of jail life. At 32 years old, Thompson had spent 7 years working in law enforcement. He wasn't the type to make waves or question the system. His father had been a cop, his uncle too. It was a family tradition he carried with pride. But what happened that evening would shake everything he believed in. As he approached cell 237, he heard raised voices. Officers Mike Sullivan and Brett Carson, both veterans with 15 years on the force, were confronting an inmate. Thompson recognized the prisoner as Marcus Wilson, a 40-year-old black man who had been brought in 3 weeks ago. Unlike many inmates who caused trouble, Wilson was known for being quiet and well-mannered, spending most of his time reading or writing in his cell. "Just sign the statement saying you fell in the shower," Sullivan was saying, his voice carrying that edge Thompson had learned to recognize, the tone that meant trouble was brewing. "Stop making accusations you can't prove." Wilson stood calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides. He was tall, probably 6'2", with grained temples and intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through people. "Officer Sullivan," he replied in a measured voice, "we both know that's not what happened. I have evidence of what's really going on in this facility, and trying to silence me won't change that fact." Carson stepped closer to the cell bars, his face reddening. "Evidence? You're just another prisoner trying to cause trouble. Nobody's going to believe your lies over the word of sworn officers." Thompson watched from the end of the corridor, his stomach tightening. He'd seen similar scenes play out before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way Wilson carried himself, or maybe it was the growing unease Thompson had been feeling lately about certain incidents he'd witnessed. "Officer Carson," Wilson continued, "I spent 12 years as a civil rights paralegal. I understand the law, and I know my rights. The evidence I have isn't just about yesterday's incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that goes back months." Sullivan exchanged a quick glance with Carson, and Thompson saw a flicker of worry cross their faces. Wilson wasn't acting like a typical inmate making empty threats. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "Listen here," Sullivan growled, reaching for his pepper spray. "You're going to learn to keep your mouth shut one way or another." That's when Thompson found his feet moving forward, almost without conscious thought. "Everything okay here?" he asked, forcing his voice to sound casual even as his heart raced. Sullivan turned, startled. "Thompson, what are you doing in B block? Aren't you supposed to be in processing?" "Supervisor asked me to do an extra walkthrough," Thompson lied smoothly. "Something about a tip about contraband." Carson's hand moved away from his belt, where it had been resting on his baton. "We're just having a chat with Wilson here about following proper procedures. Nothing that concerns you." Wilson's eyes met Thompson's, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a challenge. Thompson saw intelligence in those eyes, and something else, truth. "I'll take over here," Thompson heard himself saying. "You guys are probably needed in the mess hall for dinner duty anyway." Sullivan hesitated, clearly unhappy about the interruption. But Thompson's presence had broken the tension, and both officers finally stepped back. "We'll continue this discussion later," Carson said to Wilson, his tone carrying a clear threat. As they walked away, Thompson lingered, pretending to check the cell door's lock. Wilson waited until the other officer's footsteps faded before speaking softly. "Thank you, Officer Thompson. But you should know, this won't end here. What's happening in this facility needs to stop, and I have the proof to make that happen." Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he should report this conversation, should warn his fellow officers. That's what he'd always done before. But as he looked at Wilson's steady gaze, he realized he was standing at a crossroads. The choice he made next would either make him complicit in something he increasingly suspected was wrong, or force him to question everything he thought he knew about the job he'd chosen. Without responding, Thompson continued his patrol, but his mind was racing. For the first time in his career, he began to wonder if the thin blue line he'd sworn to protect might be casting a shadow over justice itself. 3 days after the incident with Wilson, Thompson worked the night shift. The jail was different at night. Quieter, but somehow more intense. The darkness seemed to hold secrets that daylight kept hidden, and tonight Thompson was about to discover one of them. At 2:15 a.m., Thompson was doing his regular rounds when he noticed something unusual. The security camera in the hallway leading to B block was turned slightly away from its usual position. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Thompson had walked these halls long enough to spot even small changes. He remembered Wilson's words about evidence, and something clicked in his mind. The camera's blind spot now covered a small storage closet, one that was supposed to be locked, but sometimes officers used it to store cleaning supplies. Looking around to make sure no other officers were nearby, Thompson took out his keys. His hands were sweating as he unlocked the closet door. The small space smelled of bleach and old mops, but something caught his eye behind a stack of paper towels. There, Carefully hidden inside an empty cleaning solution box was a thick manila envelope. Thompson's heart began to race. He shouldn't look. This could cost him his job, maybe even worse. But he thought about Wilson's calm confidence, about Sullivan and Carson's unusual nervousness. With shaking hands, he opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of pages of neatly written notes, dates, times, and names. There were also small scraps of paper with official letterheads, copies of internal memos that inmates shouldn't have access to. But what made Thompson's blood run cold were the photographs. Small, slightly blurry pictures taken what looked like from a smuggled phone showed officers striking inmates who were already restrained. Other photos showed bruises and injuries that didn't match any official incident reports. Each photo had a date and time written on the back in careful handwriting. Thompson recognized some of the officers in the photos. Sullivan and Carson appeared multiple times. But there were others too, including some high-ranking officers he'd always respected. One photo showed Deputy Warden Phillips accepting an envelope from a visitor in a way that clearly suggested something illegal. As he flipped through the pages, Thompson found detailed notes about racial patterns in disciplinary actions. Wilson had documented how Black and Hispanic inmates received harsher punishments for the same infractions compared to white inmates. The evidence was methodical, organized like a legal brief. A noise in the hallway made Thompson freeze. He quickly put everything back exactly as he found it, making sure the box looked undisturbed. Just as he closed the closet door, Officer Martinez rounded the corner. "Thompson, what are you doing here?" Martinez asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "Just checking supplies," Thompson replied, holding up a roll of paper towels he grabbed as cover. "Break room's out again." Martinez seemed to accept this and continued his rounds. Thompson waited until he was gone before letting out a shaky breath. His mind was spinning with what he'd seen. Later that night, during his meal break, Thompson sat alone in the staff room, pushing his sandwich around without eating it. The weight of what he'd discovered felt like a stone in his stomach. The evidence wasn't just about a few isolated incidents. It showed a whole system of abuse and corruption. He thought about his family's legacy in law enforcement. His father had always told him that being a good cop meant protecting people, all people. "The badge means you serve justice, not yourself," his dad used to say. Looking at that badge now on his chest, Thompson wondered how many officers had forgotten that lesson. Around 4 a.m., Thompson did another walk through B Block. As he passed Wilson's cell, he saw the man was awake, sitting on his bunk reading a worn paperback. Their eyes met briefly, and Wilson gave a slight nod, as if he knew. Thompson nodded back, barely perceptibly. In that small gesture, both men understood something had changed. Thompson couldn't unknow what he'd seen, couldn't pretend everything was normal anymore. The evidence hidden in that closet was like a ticking bomb, and now he had to decide what to do about it. As his shift ended and dawn began to break, Thompson drove home in silence, his mind racing. The comfortable certainties of his life as a corrections officer had crumbled, replaced by an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes protecting the law meant standing up against those who wore the same uniform as you. The next afternoon, Thompson arranged to be the officer supervising Wilson's daily exercise period. The outdoor yard was mostly empty at 2 p.m., with only a few other inmates doing their daily workout routines in the hot sun. It was the perfect opportunity for them to talk without drawing attention. Wilson was doing methodical laps around the yard when Thompson approached him. The older man didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, a knowing smile crossed his face as Thompson fell into step beside him. "I found it," Thompson said quietly, keeping his eyes forward as they walked. "The envelope in the supply closet." Wilson maintained his steady pace, his voice equally low. "I wondered who would notice the camera's blind spot first. You're more observant than your colleagues, Officer Thompson." They rounded the corner of the yard, passing under the watchful eyes of the guard tower. Thompson waited until they were past before speaking again. "You are a civil rights paralegal? How did you end up here?" A shadow passed over Wilson's face. 15 years working civil rights cases in Atlanta, specialized in police misconduct cases. Then one night, I was driving home from the office and got pulled over. The officers claimed they found drugs in my car. He shook his head slowly. Pretty convenient timing, considering I was about to file a major lawsuit against their department. Thompson felt his stomach twist. The drugs were planted? Of course they were. But it was my word against 3 officers. You can guess how that went in court. Wilson's voice held no bitterness, just a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it worse. But they made a mistake sending me here. They thought they were burying me. Instead, they put me exactly where I needed to be. They completed another lap in silence, both men lost in thought. The sun beat down on the concrete yard, making the air shimmer with heat. "That evidence you collected," Thompson finally said. "How did you manage it?" Wilson smiled slightly. "People underestimate inmates. They think we're all stupid, uneducated. They don't realize that some of us know the law better than they do. I used my time here to document everything. Other inmates helped. They knew they could trust me with their stories because of my legal background." "The photos?" "A kitchen worker with a smuggled phone. He's been released now, safe from retaliation. The internal documents came from a sympathetic clerk in administration, someone who couldn't stay quiet anymore about what they were seeing." Thompson wiped sweat from his forehead, both from the heat and the weight of what he was hearing. "Why are you telling me all this? How do you know I won't report you?" Wilson stopped walking and turned to face Thompson directly. His eyes were intense, studying Thompson's face. "Because you're different. I've watched you, Officer Thompson. You treat inmates like human beings. When you see something wrong, it bothers you. I can see it in your face. You haven't learned to shut off your conscience like some of the others." The words hit Thompson hard because they were true. He had seen things over the years that didn't sit right with him, but he'd always looked the other way, telling himself it wasn't his place to judge. "What you're doing is dangerous," Thompson warned. "If they find out, they already know I have evidence," Wilson replied calmly. "They just don't know how much, or where it is. That's why they haven't moved against me yet, but they will, soon. That's why I need someone on the inside I can trust." Their conversation was interrupted by the buzzer signaling the end of yard time. As other inmates began filing back inside, Wilson gave Thompson one last meaningful look. "Think about what kind of officer you want to be, Thompson. What kind of man you want to be, because sooner or later, we all have to make that choice." As Thompson watched Wilson walk back into the building, he felt the weight of that choice pressing down on him. The comfortable world of clear divisions between right and wrong, between officers and inmates, was crumbling. In its place was a more complicated truth, that justice didn't always wear a badge, and doing the right thing sometimes meant standing against your own. The next week was the hardest of Thompson's career. During every shift, he found himself watching his fellow officers with new eyes, noticing things he'd previously ignored. The way Sullivan deliberately skipped meals for certain inmates. How Carson accidentally lost paperwork for medical requests from minority prisoners. Small acts of cruelty that added up to something much darker. One evening, Thompson sat in his car after his shift, unable to drive home. His notebook lay open on the passenger seat, filled with his own observations now. He'd started documenting things just like Wilson had, times, dates, incidents that didn't make it into official reports. The weight of betraying his fellow officers pressed heavily on his chest. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his father. "Coming by for Sunday dinner this week, son. Your mother's making your favorite pot roast." Thompson stared at the message, thinking about how his father would react if he knew what was happening. Richard Thompson had served 30 years on the force, retiring as a respected sergeant. He'd always taught his son that the brotherhood of law enforcement was sacred, but he'd also taught him about honor, about protecting the weak. Lost in thought, Thompson almost missed seeing Carson and Sullivan entering the jail's parking lot. It was strange. Neither of them was scheduled for the night shift. He sank lower in his seat, watching as they met with Deputy Warden Phillips near the back entrance. Something about their body language set off alarm bells. Thompson grabbed his phone and started recording through his car window. The 3 men talked intensely for several minutes, Phillips gesturing angrily. Thompson couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could read the tension in their poses. Then Phillips handed something to Sullivan, a small envelope that disappeared quickly into his jacket pocket. "Money? Orders." Thompson's hands shook as he saved the video. The next morning, Thompson arrived early for his shift. The night shift officers were just leaving, and the tired faces told stories of their own. Officer Rodriguez, a rookie who usually had a friendly word for everyone, hurried past with red-rimmed eyes. "Hey, Rodriguez," Thompson called out. "Everything okay?" Rodriguez hesitated, then pulled Thompson aside into the empty break room. "There was an incident last night," he said quietly. "Wilson, the guy in 237, they took him to solitary. Said he attacked an officer, but he trailed off, looking uncertain." Thompson's heart rate spiked. "But what?" "I was there, man. Wilson didn't attack anyone. Sullivan and Carson just showed up and said they had orders to move him. When Wilson asked to see the transfer paperwork, Rodriguez swallowed hard. They said he resisted. But he didn't. He didn't fight back at all, just kept saying he wanted to see the proper documentation." Thompson fought to keep his voice steady. "Did you put this in your report?" Rodriguez looked down. "Sullivan wrote the report. Said he'd help me remember what happened. I signed it. I got a baby on the way, Thompson. I can't lose this job." As Rodriguez left, Thompson leaned against the wall, feeling sick. They were making their move against Wilson, just as he predicted. The evidence must be making them nervous enough to risk such an obvious play. During his shift, Thompson managed to get a look at the solitary confinement log. Wilson was in cell S15, listed for assaulting an officer and resisting transfer. The duration was marked as indefinite pending investigation. Thompson knew what that meant. They'd keep Wilson in solitary until they could figure out where the evidence was hidden, or until they could arrange an accident. Isolation did strange things to people. It wouldn't be the first time an inmate hurt himself in solitary. As his shift ended, Thompson sat in his car again, this time with purpose. He pulled out his phone and looked at 2 numbers he'd saved. One was for internal affairs. The other was for a newspaper reporter who'd done stories on prison conditions before. His father's words echoed in his head. A badge means protecting people. Thompson took a deep breath and started dialing. Sometimes protecting people meant making the hardest choice of all. The Internal Affairs office was located in a plain brick building downtown, far from the jail. Thompson sat in the waiting room at 7 a.m., still in his uniform from the night shift. His hands clutched a thick folder containing everything he'd gathered, his notes, the video from the parking lot, and most importantly, photos he'd taken of Wilson's evidence before returning it to its hiding place. Agent Sarah Martinez had the kind of face that gave nothing away. She sat across from Thompson in a small interview room, reviewing his materials with careful attention. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of papers. "You understand what you're doing here, Officer Thompson?" she finally asked, looking up at him. "Once we start this investigation, there's no going back. Your fellow officers will know someone talked." Thompson nodded, his throat dry. "I understand. But there's an inmate in solitary right now who might not have much time. Marcus Wilson. We're trying to silence him." Martinez made a note. "Tell me about Wilson." For the next 2 hours, Thompson laid out everything. The initial confrontation he'd witnessed, discovering the evidence, his conversations with Wilson, and finally, the suspicious transfer to solitary. As he spoke, 2 more agents joined them, taking detailed notes. "This is extensive," Martinez said when he finished, "but we'll need more than just your word. Are there other officers who might corroborate any of this?" Thompson thought of Rodriguez and his unborn baby. "Maybe, but they're scared." "And you're not?" Martinez asked, studying his face. "I'm terrified," Thompson admitted, "but I keep thinking about something my father taught me about wearing the badge. It's not just about enforcing the law, it's about standing up for what's right." Martinez nodded slowly. "We'll need to move quickly, if what you're saying about Wilson is true." She was interrupted by a knock at the door. Another agent entered with an urgent expression. After a whispered conversation, Martinez's face darkened. "There's been an incident at the jail," she said. "Wilson was found unconscious in his cell 20 minutes ago. They're saying he tried to hang himself." Thompson stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. "That's impossible. They're trying to." "Sit down, Officer Thompson," Martinez commanded. "We're moving now. I'm calling the FBI Civil Rights Division. This just became a federal case." The next few hours passed in a blur. Thompson watched as teams of agents descended on the jail. Martinez had him wait in a secure office while they conducted initial raids and interviews. Through the window, he could see police cars and federal vehicles filling the parking lot. Around noon, Martinez returned. "Wilson's alive," she said, and Thompson felt his knees go weak with relief. He's at County General under protection. The suicide attempt was staged. Our medical examiner found evidence of a struggle and defensive wounds. Sullivan and Carson, in custody, along with Deputy Warden Phillips. We found the money trail. They've been running a corruption scheme for years. Wilson wasn't their first victim, just the first one who fought back effectively. Thompson sank into a chair. What happens now? Now? Martinez gave him a small smile. Now we start cleaning house. We've already had 3 other officers come forward after they saw our teams arrive. Sometimes people just need to see that change is possible. Later that afternoon, Thompson stood in the hospital corridor, looking through the window at Wilson's room. The older man was bruised but alert, talking with federal agents. When he spotted Thompson, he gave a slight nod of recognition. Thompson's phone buzzed. Another text from his father. Seeing the news about the jail. Call me when you can, son. I'm proud of you. Tears blurred Thompson's vision. The thin blue line he'd been so afraid to cross had turned out to be an illusion. Real loyalty wasn't about protecting corruption. It was about protecting justice, even when justice wore prison clothes instead of a uniform. Martinez appeared beside him. Ready to give your official statement? This is just the beginning. We're going to need good officers to help rebuild after this. Thompson straightened his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, his badge felt like it meant something again. Yes, he said. I'm ready. The media storm hit like a hurricane. By the next morning, news vans lined the streets around the jail, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Thompson watched from inside as reporters crowded the entrance, their cameras flashing every time someone walked through the doors. Agent Martinez had prepared him for this. The press is going to be all over this story, she warned. Corruption, racism, attempted murder. It's got everything they love. But stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak for itself. The headline on the morning news read, Mass corruption exposed at Central County Jail. Multiple officers arrested. Below it was a photo of Sullivan and Carson being led out in handcuffs, their faces twisted with rage. Deputy Warden Phillips was shown in another shot, his head bowed as federal agents escorted him to a waiting car. Inside the jail, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Officers who hadn't been arrested yet walked the halls like ghosts, avoiding eye contact with each other. Some had already resigned. Others were frantically cooperating with investigators, hoping to save themselves. Thompson sat in interview room B, helping federal agents go through years of records. His knowledge of the jail's daily operations proved invaluable as they uncovered more evidence of wrongdoing. Look at this, he said, pointing to a stack of medical request forms. All these denied requests have the same signature, Officer Carson's. But he wasn't even the medical liaison. He shouldn't have been handling these at all. Agent Roberts, a tall woman with graying hair, nodded as she added the forms to their evidence pile. We're finding similar patterns everywhere. They had quite a system going. Deny medical care, plant contraband, falsify reports, then use that leverage to extort money from inmates' families. The families paid to protect their loved ones, Thompson said quietly, remembering all the times he'd seen worried relatives at visitation. Around lunchtime, Rodriguez appeared at the door of the interview room. The young officer looked nervous but determined. I want to make a statement, he announced. About Wilson's transfer to solitary. About everything I've seen. He glanced at Thompson. You were right. We can't stay quiet anymore. As Rodriguez gave his statement, more officers began coming forward. It was like a dam breaking. Once a few spoke up, others found their courage too. By evening, the investigation had expanded to include dozens of new witnesses. Thompson was leaving the building when he saw Wilson being interviewed by a news crew. He'd been released from the hospital and was wearing a suit instead of prison clothes. Despite his bruises, he spoke with the same calm dignity Thompson remembered. This isn't just about a few bad officers, Wilson was saying to the reporter. This is about a system that allowed corruption to flourish. But it's also about hope. Hope that good people will eventually stand up and do what's right. Their eyes met across the parking lot, and Wilson paused his interview to walk over. Officer Thompson, he said, extending his hand. Or should I say, key witness Thompson. Thompson shook his hand, noticing how different it felt from their furtive conversations in the exercise yard. I'm sorry it took me so long to act, he said. Wilson shook his head. You acted when it mattered most. When they put me in that cell, I thought. He paused, collecting himself. Well, let's just say your timing was perfect. A federal agent approached them. Mr. Wilson, we've finished reviewing your original case files. The evidence of planted drugs is clear. We'll be filing for immediate dismissal of all charges. Thompson watched as Wilson absorbed this news. 3 years of his life had been stolen, but his face showed no bitterness, only determination. The real work starts now, Wilson said, looking back at the jail. This place needs more than just arrests. It needs complete reform. Are you going back to your legal work? Thompson asked. Wilson smiled. Actually, I've been asked to join a federal task force on prison reform. They think my unique perspective might be valuable. As the sun set behind the jail's high walls, Thompson realized that this wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. The corruption had been exposed, but the harder task of rebuilding trust and creating real change still lay ahead. The courthouse was packed on a cold Monday morning as the first round of trials began. Thompson sat in the witness box, his testimony clear and unwavering as he described years of systematic abuse and corruption. Behind him, the gallery was filled with reporters, former inmates and their families, and officers, some there to support the investigation, others glaring with barely concealed hatred. Officer Thompson, the prosecutor asked, could you please explain to the jury what you witnessed on the night of March 15th? Thompson described finding Wilson's evidence, the suspicious meetings in the parking lot, and the staged suicide attempt. As he spoke, he could see Sullivan and Carson at the defense table, their faces hard with anger. Deputy Warden Phillips sat separately with his expensive lawyer, already trying to cut a deal. They didn't just break the law, Thompson testified, looking directly at the jury. They broke every principle that badge stands for. They turned a place of correction into a place of profit and persecution. During a break in the proceedings, Thompson found himself in the courthouse hallway next to Rodriguez, who had just finished his own testimony. My baby was born yesterday, Rodriguez said quietly, showing Thompson a photo on his phone. A little girl. When she's older, I want to tell her I did the right thing, even when it was hard. The trial lasted 3 weeks. One by one, witnesses came forward. Officers, inmates, family members, even administrative staff. The evidence was overwhelming. Wilson's careful documentation became the backbone of the prosecution's case, supported by financial records, surveillance footage, and dozens of testimonies. The defense tried to paint Thompson as a traitor, someone who betrayed his fellow officers out of personal grudges. But their arguments fell apart under the weight of evidence. When the medical examiner testified about Wilson's injuries in solitary, explaining how they couldn't possibly have been self-inflicted, even some of the defendant's supporters looked away in shame. On the day of the verdict, Thompson sat with Agent Martinez and Wilson. The jury had deliberated for only 4 hours, a sign, Martinez said, that the case was clear-cut. Guilty on all counts, the foreman announced. Sullivan and Carson faced 20 years each for attempted murder, civil rights violations, and corruption. Phillips got 15 years. Several other officers received shorter sentences for their roles in the scheme. After the verdicts, Thompson stepped out of the courthouse into a crowd of reporters. Camera lights flashed as journalists shouted questions. Officer Thompson, how does it feel to break the blue wall of silence? Will you continue working in law enforcement? Do you fear retaliation from other officers? Before he could answer, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was his father, who had attended every day of the trial. I'll handle this, the elder Thompson said to the reporters. My son did what every good officer should do. He protected the innocent and stood up against injustice. That's not breaking the blue wall. That's honoring what it should have been all along. Later that evening, Thompson sat in his father's backyard, both men nursing cold beers as they watched the sunset. The news played quietly from inside, showing footage of the defendants being led away to prison. You know, his father said, when I was on the force, we had a saying, the badge is a shield, not a sword. Somewhere along the way, some people forgot that. Thompson nodded, thinking of all the changes already happening at the jail. The new warden had implemented strict oversight measures. Body cameras were now mandatory. An independent review board had been established. Small steps, but important ones. His phone buzzed with a text from Wilson. Task force meeting tomorrow. We're reviewing applications for the new training program. Could use your input. Thompson smiled. After the trial, he'd been offered a position helping to train new officers, teaching them about ethics and accountability. It felt right, using his experience to shape the next generation of law enforcement. You know what the hardest part was? He said to his father. Not the testimony or the threats. It was taking that first step, speaking up that first time. His father nodded. Change always starts with one person willing to stand up. You did good, son. You did real good. Above them, stars began appearing in the darkening sky. The weight of the trial was lifting, replaced by something else. Hope for a better future in law enforcement, one built on justice and integrity rather than fear and silence. 1 year later, Thompson stood before a class of new recruits at the Law Enforcement Training Academy. The classroom was full of eager faces, men and women ready to begin their careers in corrections. On the wall behind him hung a framed newspaper article with the headline, Central County Jail, 1 year after the reforms. Your badge is a symbol of trust, Thompson began, touching the shield on his chest. But that trust has to be earned every single day, with every single decision you make. In the back of the room sat Marcus Wilson, now serving as a special advisor to the State Department of Corrections. He nodded encouragingly as Thompson continued his lecture. A year ago, this facility was a symbol of everything wrong with our system, Thompson said, pulling up slides showing the changes they'd made. Today, we're becoming a model for reform. But that change didn't happen by itself. It happened because people chose to do what was right instead of what was easy. After class, Wilson joined Thompson in the break room. Both men had aged during the past year, but there was a lightness to them now, a sense of purpose fulfilled. The new oversight committee approved all our recommendations, Wilson said, sliding a report across the table. Independent investigators, monthly reviews, mandatory bias training, even a new medical facility wing. Thompson smiled, remembering the dark days when such changes seemed impossible. How's the civil rights practice going? Busy, Wilson chuckled. But good busy. We've helped 3 other facilities start similar reform programs. The ripple effect is real. He paused, looking thoughtful. You know, when they first arrested me on those fake charges, I thought my life was over. Never imagined I'd end up helping to change the whole system. A group of recruits passed by the break room, respectfully nodding to both men. Thompson noticed how different these new officers were, more diverse, better educated about inmates' rights, trained to see their role as guardians rather than just guards. Rodriguez made sergeant, Thompson mentioned, his daughter's walking now. He brings her to the family days we started having at the jail. Wilson smiled. Speaking of family, how's your father doing with the new training program? Richard Thompson had come out of retirement to help develop the ethics curriculum, bringing 40 years of experience to the next generation. He loves it, Thompson said. Says it gives him hope for the future. Later that afternoon, Thompson walked through the jail corridors, doing his regular supervision rounds. The changes were everywhere. New medical response protocols, security cameras with automatic backup, even a grievance system that actually worked. He passed cell 237, Wilson's old cell. It now housed a young man who was enrolled in the jail's new GED program. The inmate was sitting at a proper desk, another new addition, studying from a textbook. In the staff room, photos on the wall showed community outreach events, training sessions, and ceremonies honoring officers who demonstrated exceptional ethics. There was even a plaque commemorating the Wilson-Thompson reforms, though both men had tried to decline that honor. Thompson's phone buzzed, a message from Martinez, now promoted to senior agent. State Commission wants you and Wilson to present the reform model next month. You free? As Thompson typed his reply, he heard the shift change bell ring. New officers came in while others left, all wearing body cameras that couldn't be turned off. Another change that had met resistance at first, but now was just part of the job. Outside in the parking lot, Thompson met up with Wilson, who was leaving after a day of training sessions. Ever regret it? Wilson asked suddenly. Standing up that day, your life would have been easier if you just looked the other way. Thompson watched the sun setting behind the jail walls, the same walls that had once housed so much darkness but now represented hope for real change. Not for a second, he replied. You know what I regret? Not doing it sooner. Wilson nodded, understanding. Well, we can't change the past, but the future? He gestured to the jail, where lights were coming on for the night shift. The future's looking brighter every day. As they walked to their cars, Thompson thought about all the lives touched by the changes they'd made. Inmates getting real rehabilitation, officers learning to serve with honor, families seeing justice done. The system wasn't perfect yet, but it was moving in the right direction. And it had all started with one choice, one moment of courage, one decision to stand up for what was right. Sometimes, Thompson realized, that's all it takes to change the world.